I set my coffee mug down and listened, because for a man who'd spent most of his life designing things to hold up, bridges, overpasses, a hospital wing downtown, you learn that sometimes the loudest strains of your life happen in the small, mean moments between sentences. They were standing by the buffet, plates half full of cold roast and rolls, as if this were a conversation about a housewarming rather than a funeral. Marcus was talking square footage like a man reading off a prospectus. Vanessa at his elbow nodding in the way a co-investor does. And someone else, Brad, Diane's husband, I think, was asking about schools in the neighborhood, or whether there was a bake sale at the church. I could see the price in their faces the way I could still see the rings on my hands without looking. She loved this place, I said. It came out softer than I'd meant. Marcus glanced at me, then at the French doors that led to the garden where Catherine's orchids had drooped in their final week. Dad, we're not saying anything about that. We're just trying to think practically. It needs work. We could get an appraiser. 3 days after the funeral, Vanessa added, and it felt like someone taking a small, careful bite out of the last thing anyone had a right to chew on. Catherine would have laughed at the timeline. She had a wry way of looking at the world, as if she could see the scaffolding inside people, the timber that held them up, and the cracks that would come later. She was 65 when she left us, a nurse with the steady hands of someone who had spent decades closing wounds, steadying breathing, holding hands through long sighs that meant endings were near. We had been married 43 years. 43 years is a long time to learn how someone breathes, where they keep the letters they're saving, the exact location in the pantry of a tin of tea you like. Catherine thought in lists. She wrote lists on legal pads tucked under the pot lids. She had an uncanny way of folding future events into plans so that the eventualities looked like inevitabilities. That's the story of our life. And also the problem. Marriage is a shared blueprint, and when one half of the design is removed, the other is suddenly expected to remodel alone. I'm Richard Patterson, recently retired civil engineer, 67 years old, and a man who thought for most of my life the biggest surprises were structural. A beam that cracked, a foundation that shifted. I had a son, Marcus, 41, an investment banker with a neat haircut and an eye for leverage. A daughter, Diane, 38, who led marketing teams and thought in campaigns. A daughter-in-law, Vanessa, who could tell you the retail value of anything in a room with the same certainty a mechanic has about the weight of an engine. And Brad, Diane's husband, who worked in commercial real estate and knew a county assessor's valuation like it was a family recipe. Then there was Tommy, my nephew, 26, a wildlife photographer with lens grease on his jeans and a stoop that was part curiosity, part apology. Tommy wasn't merely family. After my sister Linda died, Catherine and I raised him alongside our kids. He'd lived with us, learned to cook scrambled eggs the way Catherine liked them, slept in the extra room during storms. For all practical purposes, he was our son. I remember, in the months after the funeral, feeling like a man who'd been left a house with a gusting wind at every door. Friends would come by. Some would bring casseroles, and some would bring that awkward silence, waiting to see how a man would fit into a new shape. But then the pressure started. It arrived in little polite insults. "It's fine to take your time," Diane said the first week, sliding a brochure across the table. The brochure showed staged furniture and light-saturated rooms. "We just thought an appraisal would be smart. Insurance, estate planning. Not that we're rushing you." I wanted to fold that paper into a paper airplane and sail it out the back window. I didn't. Catherine would have told me to breathe, to ask for the facts, to take them in and file them away. She would have made lists. But she was gone. They came in helpful clusters. Marcus and Vanessa in the afternoons, cups of coffee and conversation that slipped toward logistics. Diane with her laptop open, charts and mocked-up images of the house on the market. Brad offering to broker things, to call a guy who could stage the place and set a price. It was a slow, polite siege. Every suggestion wore a coat of concern. Downsizing is healthy, less maintenance for a man your age. Think of the tax benefits. Each one landed like a small stone where grief still throbbed. I had been embarrassed more than once. The first appraiser arrived unannounced, a young man with a clipboard who walked through the house like a surveyor, asking questions he didn't need to ask and making notes on what to update. He praised the hardwood floors and suggested opening up some of the walls to let the light in, as if our rooms were fashionable mistakes rather than repositories of 43 years of life. It felt like someone had come through our marriage with a paint catalogue and a tape measure. At the center of that pressure was Marcus. He was not cruel. People who do harm on purpose know how to make it sting less. Marcus was efficient, the sort who saw an asset and immediately considered its utility. He had traded in stocks the way I once traded in blueprints. When your room is full of grief, the voice of a banker can feel like a discount rate applied to your memories. I suppose that's why I kept listening to him. Maybe I wanted to be told how to proceed, to be spared the decision-making that seemed to demand more stamina than I had. We held a family meeting in the dining room one chilly Sunday. The light under glass, the table cleared of casserole dishes. The kids came with proposals. Marcus talked as if he were closing a deal. List it, make improvements. We could split costs, split proceeds. Diane spoke about staging, marketing. Brad had already called a contractor he recommended. Vanessa sat silently for most of it, taking notes with the sort of precise hand that makes you suspect this isn't about sentiment at all. "We've already lined up a realtor," Marcus said finally. "They'll come by tomorrow to assess the market value. It's probably best to do it now before any weather or things decline. You don't need the burden, Dad." There was a calculation in his voice, the kind you hear from someone sizing up whether to add a second mortgage as cushion. I remember feeling a hot, private shame when I imagined my house like a spreadsheet, columns and rows and totals. "I don't want to sell," I said, though I didn't fully understand whether I meant the house itself or the symbol the house had become. Catherine had filled it with her presence. It was the place with the green sink she hated and the small, dented teapot she loved. It was where she'd kept letters from her mother in the closet. It was where I had learned to slow down. That's when the humiliation became more obvious. Marcus's jaw tightened in the way it does on a bad trade. Diane shared a look with Vanessa, quick, private, like colleagues at a meeting. They began to talk about listing, about timing, about an estate sale. There was a presumption in their words that I didn't have the right to resist. They spoke as if the future had already been signed and delivered. I tried to be reasonable. "Give me some time," I said. "I'll think about it." "You don't need to think about it," Marcus said. "We can get things moving. It's easier if you let us handle it." There was a good argument in there somewhere. At 67, retired, with the house large and full of memories, maybe smaller would be kinder. The problem was that the pace and tone of their suggestions felt less like consolation and more like a push. A shove, really. The subtle kind that comes from people who believe they're acting in your best interest because they want their inheritance sooner. You could trace Catherine's handwriting, though I didn't know it then. She'd always known people. She had a way of surveying a room and knowing whose needs were real and whose were theater. She had watched those kids grow up. She'd raised them partly via observation. She had probably seen the glint in Marcus's eye when he talked finances. Maybe she'd even predicted Vanessa's nodding. Maybe that's why she took certain steps before she died. I found the box on a Sunday afternoon, 2 days after the second appraiser had visited. It was unremarkable on the outside, a grey, fireproof safe that sat in the closet under the stairs where we kept spare bulbs and holiday decorations. Catherine had put it there, because she always said you ought to keep your instructions where you could find them. I went to the closet looking for a spare bulb and waited a beat before opening the safe, as if ceremonially asking permission from an absent spouse. Inside were a stack of envelopes, government-stamped, and a slim, folded letter in her careful, small script. I sat on the floor with the light on through the closet door, the house around me whispering with the memory of her. The letter was short, as she tended to write. Her handwriting was neat but not precious, the way someone writes when they want their message to be received and acted upon. She addressed me as Richard, which is how she often started things that needed attention. She'd written about things I already knew, her love, her last wishes. But the letter also contained specific instructions. Not lists of curtains or china, but lists that made my chest tighten, because they weren't merely practical. They were precise. She had outlined bank accounts, named beneficiaries, and added notes in the margins. For Richard, not to be touched. This is for peace, and for Tommy's studio. There were pages from a trust, as if she'd known I might not read beyond the polite paragraph. There were numbers that took my breath because they were so exact. She had arranged for $400,000 to be transferred into a Wyoming trust she had quietly established. The trust was tied to a property she'd arranged to buy and renovate, a 480-acre ranch in Teton Valley, about 40 minutes from Jackson. She had described the place in the letter the way she used to describe a good patient's pulse. Steady, promising, the kind of place that could sustain. There were photographs, poorly framed snapshots of aspens, a creek, a barn, and a note that made me laugh and then cry, "For us if you want it." You want? There was more. She had outlined a financial structure that redistributed the visible equity of the Chicago house. In plain language, she had arranged for the Chicago property to carry a second mortgage of $150,000. It was nestled among the other papers, not as a trap, but as a way to move the actual cash where she believed it would do the most good. There was also a notation about a life insurance policy of $50,000, a policy she'd kept up to date, and instructions about how those funds should be used for immediate expenses and then accounted for. She had named Tommy to receive a converted barn in the ranch as a photographer's studio in his name, and had set up the remainder to provide for me in a way that would preserve my dignity and autonomy. Reading it, I felt the immediate mix of emotions Catherine had so often warned me would follow any unexpected truth. A pang of betrayal, not toward her, but toward the children for presuming. An odd, fierce gratitude, the feeling that I'd stepped into a room someone else had arranged for me, and that I must now learn how to move through it without stumbling. The numbers steadied me in a way. When you've spent a life lining up beams and loads, numbers become companions. They don't lie. They make clear what will hold. I found, folded in the very last envelope, a card with a short note addressed to Tommy. She had written to him like a parent who knows the world will be rough, but wants to leave a map. Use the barn for your work. Keep it simple, no galleries without a good reason. It was playful. It was exactly her. I took the documents to the kitchen table and spread them out like plans. The house felt too small and too large at the same time, full of mornings when Catherine had called me into the kitchen for coffee and the sort of silences that mean comfort. I called Sarah Chen that evening. Sarah's office was small but efficient, the kind you imagine tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. Practical, a Wyoming lawyer whose name I had seen in the margins of Lefferts and Combs estate references. Catherine had used her before. Sarah recognized the estate language as if she had written it herself, which may well have been true. When I first spoke to her, my voice betrayed me. There's a particular way grief makes you sound like you're chewing on an old coin. She was a steady voice on the other end, precise, immediate, unshaken by the expectation of grief or resentment. "Yes," she said when I explained briefly that Catherine had anticipated certain things. She prepared for a variety of outcomes. She left very explicit instructions. She also established a trust in Wyoming and moved funds into it. The property is renovated and held in that trust. You knew? I asked. I don't know why I asked like that, as if she'd been a co-conspirator. In a professional capacity, Sarah said. When clients ask, we advise on land, trusts, and beneficiaries. In this case, Mrs. Patterson elected to do most of this under her own discretion. She left clear beneficiary designations and a letter to you for context. It feels like she was 2 steps ahead of me, I said. She planned for you, Sarah answered. That's a different thing. The next days folded into a pattern. I listened to Sarah as she explained in plain English what had been done, not as a lawyer would explain to other lawyers, but as to someone who needed to understand without being overwhelmed. There were forms, she said, and protocols. She had the documentation, and Catherine's records were meticulous. The trust, the deed paperwork, the funds, they were organized. If someone had reason to object, the paperwork would speak plainly. Catherine had made sure of that. Part of me wanted to leave the documents sealed, to keep those pages folded like a relic. Another part, the practical part that had been honed by budgets and timelines and the comfortable certainty of an engineer, wanted to read every line, to know exactly the paths she had carved. I read them all. I learned that she had arranged for the ranch to be fully paid for by the trust, so that the property itself did not carry an encumbrance. The $400,000 transfer into the Wyoming trust was a lump sum, quiet and indisputable. The second mortgage on the Chicago house, the $150,000, would change the visible equity of our home in a way that would not be obvious to someone who glanced at the sale price. There were also letters Catherine had written. Not legal arguments, but reasons, explaining her choices in personal terms. Love. The desire for me to have a life beyond the city. A place where Tommy could pursue his work without the costs he'd always fretted over. I felt foolish and grateful all at once. Foolish because I had been surprised she could plan so thoroughly. Grateful because she had thought of things I would never have prioritized for myself. A man can be stubborn about his dignity. He can also be slack about practicalities. Catherine was neither of those things. She had been both tender and unrelenting in the way she loved. When I finally told the kids there were documents and that Catherine had left them in a safe, their faces shifted in that small animal way people do when a feeder has been discovered. Diane's expression softened for a second, then hardened into professional concern. Marcus asked for a copy, ostensibly to get his own financial house in order. Vanessa's eyes lingered on the photographs of the ranch for a beat too long. You know what she left? Marcus asked, a few days after I told them. Yes, I said. She left instructions and a trust, a property in Wyoming. She set it up deliberately. Marcus's mouth pressed thin. She had the right to do that, he said finally. It's just unexpected. Everything about death is unexpected, I said. That night, after the kids left, I sat with Catherine's letter until I could memorize the way she'd closed it. She wrote, as she often did when she wanted to make sure one last point was clear. Live, she said, and don't be stupid. It was in that order. It was everything she'd ever wanted for me, a squeezable command and a blessing. I pretended not to hear the mutterings around me when the subject of the house resurfaced. They called it estate management. To me it felt like a slow abrasion of the intimacy Catherine and I had built. It was one thing to go through paperwork. It was another to be told that the things you loved were suddenly just property. But then, what is a house if not both? A place and a ledger. On a grey Thursday, Marcus announced that the realtor had prepared a preliminary valuation and proposed an initial market price. He called it prudent. He called it timely. He used that voice again, the one that worried about depreciation. There were murmurs of contractors and floor plans. Someone suggested staging as if the house were a volume to be opened and inspected between guests. I did not much enjoy being a passive variable in their equations, so I started to act in a way that might be called practical. I packed things, but only the things that mattered to me, the small private objects Catherine and I had accumulated, the letters, the things that fit in a box and could be moved without a crew. I put them in a storage unit and took pictures of the rooms, cataloguing where things had been for myself, more than for anyone else. They did not notice, not yet. People who want to believe in the inevitability of their inheritance are not often looking for the quiet rearrangements a grieving person makes to protect himself. It was around then that I called Sarah again. There was a mixture of relief and trepidation in my voice. I was about to step into the plans Catherine had left and give them motion. I did not know what it would mean to carry out someone else's last wishes in full. I had been an engineer for years. I could draft plans and supervise projects, but everyone told you that family matters were not schematic. They were, for better or worse, messy. Still, Catherine had left instructions for a reason. Sarah was blunt, the exact sort of person Catherine liked. Her instructions are clear, she said. There is a trust. The property has been renovated as per her letter, and the beneficiaries and uses are set out. If you want to activate the trust for your move and for Tommy's studio, I can walk you through the legalities and the next steps. It will require signing documents so the trustees can act. Hearing the word activate made my stomach flip. It made the plan less like a historical curiosity and more like a motion. It was one thing to hold a map. It was another to choose the road. I remember telling Sarah that I needed to sleep on it, that the grief made everything heavy, and that I wanted to be sure I was moving because I wanted to, not because I was being pushed. She was patient. That's the point of Mrs. Patterson's planning, she said quietly. She wanted choices available at the right times. She wanted you to have them. I put the papers back in the fireproof safe that night, but I could feel the outline of a future Catherine had arranged for me. The ranch sat in my mind like a promise. The way she had written about it, aspens lining a creek, a barn converted to a studio, the night sky without the city haze. It felt like breath itself. I imagined Tommy there, lenses catching elk in the morning, the creek's light on his face. I wanted that more than I'd realized. Maybe that's what Catherine had known, that the option would matter to me more than any contest about equity. Even as I considered it, the other side of the family was assembling their forces. They continued to talk about listing dates and showings. Marcus had called to say someone might come by to measure the house for the online listings. Diane had a staging company in mind. Vanessa, in the way she does, had already thought about what could be sold at the estate sale and what should be saved. I am not a vindictive man. I am a man who reads loads and responds. But there is a quiet kind of resentment that lives in the way people presume. It sits in your chest like a pebble. Catherine's letter cut that pebble out and replaced it with something else, a complicated gift, a gift that demanded a decision. The papers had made the outline clear. The trust in Wyoming held the ranch and the $400,000 she'd quietly moved there. The Chicago house was encumbered with a second mortgage of $150,000. The life insurance of $50,000 would cover immediate needs. Tommy had been provided for with a space to work. Catherine's handwriting, her photographs, her careful legal drafts, all of them arranged so that the surface story, the house in Chicago, would have an appearance that would not tell you where the substance lay. I remember driving to see Tommy that weekend to unwrap the idea of a ranch with him. He had come by earlier with a coffee and told me about a recent trek where he'd watched an elk bull across a meadow and nearly wept with the solitude and beauty. He had the kind of reverence that made me think he would use any space given to him in the way Catherine intended. Not as a trophy, but as a workshop. His face brightened at the idea of a barn with skylights. "You'll learn to ride a horse," he said, "and they've got real dark skies out there. You can see the Milky Way." I laughed because Catherine had always wanted me to see stars without the smog of the city. I laughed, and then I smiled in a way that felt like opening a window after a long winter. But the window had bars. While Tommy and I talked of barns and elk, Marcus and Diane continued to assemble their plan to list. Their momentum made me think of force vectors. I could feel the push from Chicago and the pull from Wyoming. Catherine had left me a compass and perhaps a roadmap. The family had different expectations. This is the place I stood in, as I signed up for a call with Sarah that would mark the beginning of something I had not entirely chosen, though I would come to own it. Not simply the house in Wyoming, but the narrative of who I would be next. Grief is a kind of remapping. Catherine had redrawn some county lines for me. My job had become to decide whether to travel them. The phone call with Sarah was brief, but exact. She told me that, legally, everything Catherine had done was in order. That is not the same as saying it was simple. It was precise, lawful, and, in a way I could not yet fully accept, irreversible in practical terms. There would be papers to sign to allow the trustees to act on the trust, to allow Tommy to have the studio set aside, and to set in motion the transfer processes Catherine had outlined. She made sure I understood that these actions were not some sleight of hand, but mechanisms Catherine had selected to accomplish what she felt needed to be done. "Do you want me to proceed with the activation?" Sarah asked. I held off answering immediately. I thought of Catherine in the kitchen jotting down items on pads. I thought of her folding the letter and tucking it where she knew I'd find it. I thought of the children hovering in the dining room like vultures disguised as caregivers. I thought of Tommy with his camera, and of an image Catherine had painted in the letter. Me on a porch where the sunset made the mountains look like an old painting. "Yes," I said finally. "Do what she asked." There was a quiet in the line, the implicit weight of an answer given under the gaze of an absent spouse. Sarah acknowledged the instruction, and the wheels that Catherine had laid down began, with a modest click, to roll. I still had no idea what Marcus would do when he learned the specifics. I had no surety that Diane would not contest something, or that Vanessa wouldn't call to argue semantics. I only knew that Catherine had done what she did best. She had prepared so that I could choose. I had chosen to trust her. That night, with the trunk of the fireproof box empty and the papers transferred back to their safe place, I polished the mug she used for tea. It was an ordinary ritual, domestic and small. Outside the window, the city blinked. Apartments and apartment lights, the distant bog of traffic. Inside, I stacked the cardboard boxes I'd been keeping in the guest room and labeled them in pencil. Kitchen. Books, Catherine's papers. The labels felt like prayers. I was aware then that I was stepping into a kind of stewardship. I would have to perform the unglamorous parts of life, sign some papers, talk with trustees, meet with surveyors. But I would also, perhaps, be given a place that Catherine had quietly fixed up for me. I would have, if I wanted it, a ranch where the sky was unlit by sodium vapor, where Tommy could hang his prints, where I could learn to mend fences. I lay awake that night thinking of the creek Catherine had mentioned, and of the way she had written the word home. She had put her faith into plans and into people. She had given Tommy a space for work, and me a path to a life where my days might not be measured by creaks in staircases, but by the slow tilt of light across aspens. But of course, life in Chicago is not so easily abandoned. There were things to settle, appraisers, decisions, and a family that believed in certain predictions. Some of them had been impatiently waiting for the day the ledger would pay out. When morning came, my phone rang. It was Marcus. He was even more direct than usual. "We need to talk about next steps," he said. And so the next phase began. For them, a negotiation over timing and process. For me, the invocation of a plan Catherine had left to preserve certain things for people she loved. I had chosen to activate it, and the consequences would ripple outward like stones dropped into a pond. I did not yet know the size of the ripples. If you want to know what she left behind and how it changed everything, stick with me. There's a letter you'll want to read, and there are decisions that had to be acted on before anyone realized what was really at stake. Marcus called again the next morning, the kind of call that felt more like a scheduled check-in than a son checking on his father. "We should finalize the listing," he said. "It's just paperwork at this point, Dad. If you want, we can sign the necessary papers, get the realtor involved, and I'll handle the sale." He spoke like a man arranging a meeting, not a son talking about a home where his parents had lived for decades. I played my part. If Catherine had wanted me to be surprised by nothing, then I would not be the one to spring any shocks. I agreed to meet, to look over the papers, to let a realtor into the house. The slight was in the timing. The plan Catherine had left required signatures and motions, trustee activations and recorded instruments. All of it had to be performed with a certain quietness so as not to alarm the family before the trust's terms took effect. Sarah handled the legal choreography. She moved with the kind of economy and clarity Catherine would have admired. Short emails, a firm handshake when we met in her office, a grey folder of paperwork she slid across the table as if she were merely handing me a set of plans. The trust had been funded with the $400,000 Catherine moved into Wyoming. The ranch had been purchased and renovated under that trust. The trustees had the authority to set aside Tommy's converted barn and to make the funds available for my relocation and support. The Chicago property's apparent value had been adjusted against a $150,000 second mortgage Catherine had arranged. In practice, that mortgage reduced the equity someone could realistically extract at sale. None of that was a secret. Not in the way a secret implies surprise at the last minute. Catherine had been painstakingly public in the private ways she mattered most. Her paperwork was meticulous, the dates and signatures precise. If anyone came looking for ambiguity, they would find none. Sarah printed copies of the documents, which I placed in the same grey fireproof box I'd opened weeks before, until the day came to act. To the children, I remained the man who had said he would think about it. I invited the realtor to measure rooms. I listened to Marcus pitch listing strategies in the dining room. Diane texted staging ideas and mood boards. They were comfortable. They'd taken for granted that discomfort was temporary and that their presumptions would be borne out with signatures and lines on a page. What they had not accounted for was that Catherine had written the lines first. The trustees executed the activation in discrete steps. Documents were signed in Sarah's office. Trustees filed the necessary instruments with the county, recorded the trust's interest in the ranch and, most importantly, completed the paperwork that formalized the second mortgage on the Chicago property. For the casual observer checking only the sale price online, the house still looked like a windfall. For someone who actually tallied obligations and liens, the arithmetic looked far less generous. On moving day, I insisted on performing one final domestic ritual. I brewed coffee the way Catherine liked it and placed the two mugs, her chipped blue one and my plain white, on the kitchen table as if the ritual could steady me. Tommy arrived early, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hands full of camera straps. He helped me sort the boxes I'd been preparing for weeks. The letters, the photos, the things with real weight to them. We packed Catherine's silver flatware in one box and her loose dog-eared notebooks in another. I labeled each box in pencil. The boxes that mattered most to me, her teapot, her mother's letters, the stack of little notes she had left in books, were packed into a separate crate that I told no one about. Movers came with a clatter of dollies and a polite efficiency. I had arranged for some crates to be moved to a storage unit in the city, simple logistics that would not seem strange to anyone watching. What no one knew was that when the crates hit the storage unit, Sarah arranged for them to be insured and then sent to Wyoming, routed through the trust's logistics so that Tommy's eventual studio could be filled with the things that mattered. A family friend helped with the shipping, someone Catherine had worked with on a community project and whom she trusted. It's possible this is the sort of detail I ought to hide, but she would have relished the quiet absurdity of routing a teapot through 3 states so that it might sit under a prairie window where the light would show its glaze. There was an unspoken choreography in my pretending. At times I let the children think they were moving the pace. I called contractors for minor repairs and signed an innocuous-looking consent form or two to allow showings. I went with them to the town hall to drop off an application for a temporary permit. They wanted to be thorough. And I listened to Marcus talk about timing as if he were planning a merger. Meanwhile, Sarah and the trustees recorded the mortgage, the bank's lien attached, and the trust moved from paper to reality. The day the deed came across properly recorded, Diane felt triumphant. "Finally," she said, rubbing her hands like someone who'd just closed a deal. Marcus sent me an email with a line about how soon they could hold an estate sale and whether I wanted anything in particular set aside. Vanessa texted photos of potential buyers' wish lists. They believed they had acquired entitlement, as if the right to possession were the same thing as possession itself. A month later, the house was listed. It looked lovely in its online photos, bright rooms, neutral staging, sunlit garden, but figures on paper tell a different story than sunlit photos. The second mortgage of $150,000 sat under the recorded deed. Realtor fees, closing costs, taxes, and the mortgage meant that when an offer finally came and a sale closed, the posture of triumph shifted. The gross sale price might have pleased a distant observer. After the accountants did their count, after the mortgage was paid, and after the life insurance had been applied to immediate expenses, Catherine's $50,000 had covered what it was meant to cover. The net was small. There was about $53,000 left to split among them, after fees and costs. It was the kind of number that looks petty on a balance sheet and tragic in a kitchen that had known laughter. I won't pretend there was no friction. Marcus was furious at first. Diane was stunned. They had expected a different arithmetic. They did not like the outcome. They consulted lawyers, of course. This generation loves counsel in the same way previous generations loved the family Bible. There were demands and questions, and the sort of indignation people show when their assumptions meet a ledger. They tried to contest certain elements, to argue that Catherine had been of unsound mind, or that the signatures were somehow invalid. It was not malicious exactly. Legal battles rarely are at first. It was practical. Someone had convinced them that contesting might alter the numbers. It did not. Catherine's handwriting, her dates, the notations, the bank statements, everything was in order. Sarah had done what Catherine would have wanted. She organized the facts so clearly that any court could see the intent. There were affidavits, depositions, and a brief flurry of motions. We sat in a bland courtroom one afternoon, their lawyer asking questions that implied malice where there was none. The judge looked at the paper trail and at the trust documents and handed down the kind of quiet decision that leaves no drama, just a practical end. The contest failed. It felt to me like justice of a particular sort, quiet, final, and without the flourish of public vindication. When the sale completed and the $53,000 was divided, no one made a spectacle of it. They took the checks and went home. There was embarrassment under the anger, which is always an unpleasant companion to grief. Marcus stopped speaking to me for a while, which hurt more than I expected. It is strange, the way children sometimes see a parent as a fixture rather than a person with wants and needs. They had seen the house as a balance in their future, not a list of memories that Catherine had tended like a garden. Meanwhile, the ranch had become real in the best ways. Tommy moved out west before I did to oversee the final touches on his studio. When I flew out, Sarah met me at the small regional airport and drove me the last 40 minutes in a truck that rattled in a way that felt like honesty. The drive climbs and opens and then becomes so vast that you feel compressed and then released. Teton Valley breathes in aspens and sagebrush. The ranch sits on 480 acres that roll toward a creek, with aspens in stands like place markers, and a barn converted into a studio with skylights that make a photographer weep. The main house was renovated in the gentle way Catherine would have wanted, solid, modest and unfussy, with windows placed so the morning would come like a hand. There were porches that faced the range and a kitchen big enough for 2 people and their visitors. The barn, once a place for hay and tools, had been lifted and remade with insulation and a big, north-facing window for the soft-light photographer's favor. Tommy's prints already filled the walls of that studio, images of elk in frost, a cow moose at dawn, a creek bending like a silver wire. He had not become famous overnight. He didn't need to be. He had a place to work without the underlying anxiety of how to pay for a darkroom or whether a landlord would raise the rent. The first night I walked the property with Tommy, the sky unfolded. So many stars it felt like a mistake in the way the city had once hidden them. He carried 2 mugs of the cabin's coffee and offered me one as if we were old conspirators. "You'll love it here," he said. "You'll learn to sleep when the world does." I did more than sleep. I learned to ride a horse clumsily and to mend a split rail fence with a hammer and a stubborn will. I learned which part of the pasture the wind tended to cut through and which ditches needed attention before spring runoff. There is a peace in small tasks, the way each fence post you set lays down a day's work that will hold another day. I learned how to listen to the land, which is not the same as owning it. Tommy's presence made the place feel like family in a way that textbooks cannot describe. He kept his cameras in a corner and his boots by the door, and he would bring me prints to hang in the living room. Images that made me remember Catherine's love for light, her instinct for choosing what to preserve. He taught me to load a camera, and in doing so, reminded me that there was more than one way to observe a thing. I wrote letters I never sent and finished a few small projects I had postponed for years. I wrote notes about Catherine that were not memorials but lists, things she would have liked to know I noticed, the way the creek runs early in June, the smell of sage warmed by sun, the sound of elk calling at dusk. I started a small journal with that title, Catherine's Things. It was the kind of domestic catalogue she would have enjoyed. There were still calls from the city, and the occasional tension when the children visited, which they did from time to time. Marcus came once, quiet, contrite in a way that seemed forced but was probably as sincere as his temperament allowed. He showed me his phone with the divorce papers he'd recently signed. The marriage to Vanessa had crumbled under pressures he chose not to explain fully. The details weren't mine to live inside, but the fact that he called to tell me felt like something of a surrender. "Dad," he said over the line, voice brittle at first and then softer. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For how we spoke, for how I behaved. I should have listened." There was a pause in which I imagined his life as a collapsed scaffolding. Someone who had held the whole thing up and then found pieces missing. I had been angry, yes. I had felt betrayed and foolish. But Catherine had designed a kind of remedy, not as revenge, but as preservation. Marcus's apology was not a key that unlocked everything. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not an obligation. It's a decision you make on your terms. "You're welcome to come see it," I said eventually. "If you want to apologize, do it in person. If you want to talk, come for a weekend." My voice sounded stranger than I felt, somewhere between invitation and test. He came. We walked the creek and he apologized properly, without the protective armor of a banker's cadence. We did not attempt to reconstruct the years that had led to that moment. He spoke more about missing things than about his regrets. Missing his mother. The life he expected to inherit, the way his own choices had redirected him. He was single now and looking, in the quiet way of a man who has lost someone and is trying to find out who he is without them. I did not give him what he wanted in the way he had expected. I did not erase Catherine's choices. Those choices had been her form of compassion. but I opened the ranch to him for visits if he behaved with humility and care. I made it clear that reconciliation would be measured by his actions, not by apologetic words. Catherine did not plan for grand gestures. She planned for steady, ordinary life. I would honor that. Tommy found his rhythm. He set up his darkroom, started accepting small commissions, and occasionally sold a print or two to a collector passing through the valley. He was content in a way that had nothing to do with fortune, content in the steadiness of a place that supported the work you loved. Watching him at the window of his studio made me think Catherine had known the sort of person he was. Not someone who would squander a gift, but someone who would use it adoringly. Seasons changed. Winters came with snow weights that bowed the aspens. Summers ripened the valley into a palette of greens and browns that tire one's eyes into gratitude. I learned to start a stove without thinking, and to say hello to neighbors who drove horses down main lanes. There were birthdays and Sunday dinners, with a range of people who came with the quiet generosity of those who choose to live away from the city. Sometimes I read Catherine's letters aloud, partly to hear her voice and partly to keep the rhythm she'd left. Once, late at night, I opened a book I hadn't touched since the move. Tucked in between the pages was a slim note in her handwriting, the kind of thing she might have slipped where she knew I'd find it months later, when my stubbornness had softened. It said, in the compact, wry way she had, "Richard, you are allowed to be happy. I don't mean small happiness. Go big if you can." It was a benediction that felt equal parts command and tenderness. I laugh now when I think about how Catherine managed to be there for me after she was gone. Her planning was not a revenge play. It was a layout of love. She had given me a place to heal, a place where time could unhook some of the sharper edges of grief. She had given Tommy a space to grow. She had, in an ordinary but radical way, recalibrated futures. Marcus's life had been altered. He lost access to a presumed windfall and was forced to reckon with choices he hadn't wanted to face. That was part of the consequence. But he also found a way back, haltingly and with work, which Catherine would have liked. People sometimes ask whether I think she was cruel. That question always seems to be phrased in the voice of someone who confuses tough love with malice. She was neither cruel nor vindictive. She was practical in the way nurses tend to be. She saw the long arc of what would help, and she arranged the instruments accordingly. She expected that not everyone would like it. She expected resistance. She expected, too, that in the end, life would keep going. Months slide into years in ways that startle you only when you remember how young you used to be. I have not missed the city the way I thought I might. The thunder of traffic and the glowering architecture have been replaced by light and the sound of my own breathing at dusk. I have written a small book, not a bestseller, but a modest thing about love, memory, and how to measure a life. I write in her voice sometimes, and sometimes I write in mine. I send copies to people who ask for them, and keep one on the shelf for myself. There are mornings when I sit on the porch with a coffee mug and listen to the creak and think of the first scene I ever told you about. The funeral and the buffet, and Marcus talking square footage as if grief were a ledger to be balanced. The image is absurd, and it is true. Catherine's secret was not a device to humiliate anyone. It was a gift that redirected what would have otherwise been a very small inheritance into something that sustained work and quiet living. The ranch in Wyoming is the place she left behind for me and for Tommy. And it changed Marcus's future by making the choice hers to shape. Sometimes when the light leans long across the aspens, Marcus will sit on the porch with me, and we will talk about things we did not understand earlier. I do not pretend every bitterness is dissolved. Old resentments have a way of surfacing like roots through soil. But there has been a slow mutual mending. He does not own what his mother left. He does not need to. He visits more often now, bringing small repairs or a casserole. He helps mend a fence in a way that looks practiced, as if the work is doing for him what the ranch did for me. It steadies. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already know the headline, "The Secret My Wife Left Behind, a Ranch in Wyoming, and My Son's Future." But the secret was less about hiding wealth and more about realigning lives. It was Catherine's last design, not a ledger, not a trap, but a plan to preserve what mattered and to make space for the people she loved to continue living, each in their own way. If this resonates with you, if you've had a surprising legacy or a quiet gift arrive at the most unexpected time, share it. I'd like to hear how life rearranged itself for you, and if you want more of these kinds of stories, stay a while. There are more to tell. Sometimes I go out just before sundown to the fence that runs along the north pasture. I lean on it, feeling the grain of the wood under my palms, and watch how the light hits the aspens. I tell Catherine about small things, an elk we saw, Tommy's latest photo, how the book is coming along. I say things out loud in the way people do when they want history to know they're still listening. There is a comfort in that ritual, and a gratitude so simple it feels like a prayer. Her secret was a map to a different life. The ranch is the place she left behind. Marcus's future was bent by it in ways neither of us could have predicted. But life, as it does, kept moving. We learned to live in the arrangement she made, with all the imperfect grace she always managed to bring to everything she touched. Disclaimer: these stories are made up, created for dramatic purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is accidental. Subscribe now to our Peter Stories YT and join a community that values powerful stories, deep emotions, and life lessons that truly matter.